Rebecca, was somebody from School Boards Association gonna kick us off, right? We're waiting.
Yep, no, I will be doing that. Just giving it another couple minutes and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Lori, is the presentation showing properly?
Hey, Patty Carmichael, I see that you had your hand raised. Did you need something? All right. All right. Okay, I think we're going to begin. Good afternoon and welcome to all board members, administrators, and business managers. Thank you for joining us for this month's Lunch and Learn. In today's session, we will be discussing the second round of federal impact funding, or the ESSER II. Lori Matsky from the Department of Public Instruction will be our presenter. Questions are encouraged and will benefit our discussion, so please ask away. To ask a question, please either enter your question in the Q&A box or click the raise your hand button. When we are ready to take your question, we will call your name and unmute you so that you may ask your question. If you raised your hand during the discussion, but your question was answered, please click the raise your hand icon again so that you can deselect. We will be recording today's webinar and posting it to the NDSBA website under resources. It is also being live streamed to our NDSBA YouTube channel. And finally, just a reminder, you have all been muted to minimize any background noise. I'm now going to turn it over to Lori Matsky. Lori, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here. And it might be helpful if we can just hold off on questions until the end. There aren't a whole lot of slides, and so it might be easier just to run through the presentation and then do questions at the end. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here. I think we're just going to go ahead and jump right in and get started with our presentation today on the federal stimulus package. So let's begin. As most of you know, we had the first stimulus package passed back in March of 2020, and that the CARES Act provided us with ESSER I funding for school districts. And so now on December 27th of 2020, President Trump signed the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. And that provided into law, providing even more significant funding for education. Most of these acts all have little acronyms like ESSA, No Child Left Behind, CARES Act. This one is being called the CRRSA, C-R-R-S-A. So if you hear that, that is the acronym that has been given to this latest stimulus package. Now, one thing that's important to note is that this legislation that was passed in December is a combined stimulus and appropriation bill for the next school year. And so they lumped it all into one big bill. We are going to be providing information on the appropriations bill in this week's blast. We've been getting estimated allocations for the various title programs, Title I, Title II, Title IV, 21st Century Learning, etc. So we'll provide information on that in the blast. For today's presentation, we are focusing exclusively on the stimulus portion of the CRRSA Act. Let's begin with kind of a comparison of the two bills, two packages. It's kind of interesting to compare it to ESSER I. And so with the first one, the CARES Act passed in March 27th. Obviously, the total bill was much, much higher than the 30 million because it incorporated funding for state governments and hospitals and all kinds of things. But the portion designated to education was that 30 billion. And so in comparison, this one that was just passed in December, the funding appropriated to education was 82 billion. So it was significantly more funding for education in this second package. They're very, very similar in how they were passed and how they're set up. They provide funding to 4 key areas for education: BIE funding, GEAR funding, which goes to governors, the ESSER funding, which you are all familiar with, which goes to K-12 education, and then funding for higher ed. And so similarly in this second package here, you have the same 4 categories receiving funding. That $82 billion there is distributed amongst those 4 categories. And so again, just kind of going through and comparing. So the first round, K-12 education got that $13 billion. This time we have $54 billion going to state education agencies in the ESSER II funding. Again, the setup is very similar. 90% of these dollars will go to school districts. 10% can be retained at the state level for state level activities. North Dakota's ESSER I allocation was right around that 33 million. Our ESSER II allocation is 135,924,393 million. And so again, significantly more funding. The governor again will also receive GEAR funding. So the governor received almost 6 million under ESSER, under the CARES Act, and we'll get about 6.7 here under this second package. So just a little bit of a comparison there that shows how much additional funding this second relief package has. Just to provide some background information, again, very similar purpose to the first round of stimulus funding, to continue to support our students, our teachers, our schools during this very historic pandemic. And so just the federal government wants to provide funding for schools and educators to try and cope and make it through this. The period of availability is similar, except they extended a year. So we actually can go back to March 13th, which is when they enacted the CARES Act and when the ESSER I funds began. That might be difficult for school districts because most have, closed out their books for that, through June 30th. But, if there are expenses that haven't already been claimed that are COVID related, we can go back to March 13th. And then they just extended it by 1 year. So instead of September 30th, 2022 for ESSER I, these funds can be spent through September 30th, 2023. So the amount of funding that will go out to our North Dakota school districts is that $122 million figure there. That is what is going to be delivered to our school districts. Again, just like with ESSER I, it is based on the Title I funding formula. That is mandated in the law, and so that's how all states have to give out ESSER II funding, by using the Title I funding formula. ESSER II funds, similar to all federal dollars, will be dispersed to districts on a reimbursement basis. There has been lots of conversation with administrators and during testimony about ending fund balances, but really that should not be an issue, because it does not show up as revenue for school districts until you submit a request for reimbursement through web grants. And so it's not like you get these dollars, it's put into your local accounting system and you have all of these dollars. It's only on a reimbursement basis. We don't even have it here at DPI. It's in the G5 system. You request it from us, we request it from the G5 system. So it'll be on a reimbursement basis. I know probably the most important question that everyone has is, how is this ESSER II funding going to roll out? And so you've seen this statement here in the blast the last couple of weeks, and that is still our current situation, which is that we have to realize that these funds are being handled differently than the first round of ESSER I funding. We were not in a legislative session, so we were able to very quickly run allocations and get those funds out to our North Dakota school districts. However, on January 5th, we began our North Dakota 67th Legislative Assembly, and our North Dakota legislators have elected to weigh in on the rollout of this ESSER II funding. Superintendent Baszler has been participating in many hearings, many meetings, fielding questions from legislators. So there's lots of conversation going on right now, and they're just kind of weighing in as far as what our options are. The Department of Public Instruction is trying to work behind the scenes to get everything ready so that when we have the go-ahead to move forward, we will be ready to go. So we have created a new ESSER II website on the DPI site to house all key information. So if you go to the COVID funding page, you will see all the little blocks of ESSER I funding, ESSER II funding, GEAR funding, the core, resiliency, all of that is on that COVID funding page. And then again, additional information will be disseminated to school districts just as soon as we have it, just as soon as we get the go-ahead. As far as allocations, we have posted the state allocation chart from the U.S. Department of Ed. So if you click on the link, or if you just go to our ESSER II website and click under the resources tab, you will see there the state allocation chart that we received. North Dakota's state allocation for ESSER II is actually $135,924,393. And so the difference there in the amount I said is going to school districts, which is 122 million, is the difference of the state set aside. Jamie Mertz will very soon be running district allocations. And then as soon as we have authority to post those, we will post them on the ESSER II website. What you can do right now is you can estimate what your district ESSER II allocation is going to be. If you take your ESSER I allocation and you multiply it by 3.5, that will give you a very close idea of what you're going to receive. So if you do that math, you should at least get that amount. It might be slightly higher, but we figured it's best to go on the safe side so you're get good news instead of are disappointed. So if you take it times 3.5, you should at least get that amount with your ESSER II allocation. Basically, there are 5 key changes between ESSER I and ESSER II that are important to note. Number 1, we kind of already addressed, is that period of availability. They both begin on March 13th, and then these ESSER II funds are just available for an additional year until September 30th, 2023. One of the major changes for the larger districts who have non-public schools is that there is no equitable services provision. In North Dakota, it wasn't quite as contentious, but nationwide, that whole equitable services provision in ESSER I was very problematic. The U.S. Department of Ed put out guidance, and then Congress retracted that and changed their mind. There are all kinds of pending lawsuits because of it. So because of all those problems, Congress decided not to put an equitable services provision on this ESSER II funding. So for all you districts with non-public schools, you will not have to worry about designating a certain percent of your ESSER II funds for non-public schools. Now, in lieu of that, so that they're not left out, Congress appropriated a separate pot of funding for non-public schools. And that is called the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools Program, EANS. Now, interestingly enough, what they did was they included the funding for these non-public schools in the governor's GEAR grant. So when you saw that $6 million figure that the governor is getting in North Dakota for GEAR funding, a portion of that, in fact, a quite large portion, 4 million out of the 6 million, is for these non-public schools. So the governor needs to apply, and they actually have a deadline. They only have 30 days. And so the governor needs to apply for these funds. And then what's really interesting, and it's not a can, it's a must, governors must then transfer it over to the state education agency to administer the program. So the governor will apply for these non-pub funds, and then DPI will administer the program. Again, we would get about 4 million in this appropriation. Ann Ellison was the individual at DPI who was leading that the equitable services provision under ESSER 1. And so she has again been identified as the lead for this ENS program. She has been working very closely with Maria Nessett. And so as soon as there is information to share, Ann will be reaching out to non-public schools and providing more information on that category of funding. The third key change pertains to maintenance of effort. So there is no supplement supplant provision in ESSER 2. There was not a supplement supplant provision in ESSER 1 either. However, there is a strong maintenance of effort requirement, and it differs a little bit from the maintenance of effort provision in ESSER 1. This one here is based on a proportionality rate. So basically what that means, that's key to state legislatures, because that means they cannot cut DPI or education funding at a higher proportional rate than they cut other entities. And so it's mainly going to be a key requirement for our state legislature to keep in mind as they're funding K-12 education. And it's also important to note that, since there's no supplement supplant provision, districts can pay for many expenses that in the past you have paid for with state or local funds. So some examples could be transportation, food service, cleaning supplies. So again, no supplement supplant. It is possible to use ESSER 2, just like you did with ESSER Fund, to pay for some things that have historically been paid for with state or local funding. The key here is that it has to be an allowable use of funds. And so that is why, it can't be used in the funding formula or just to pay for K-12 education in general, because this law, just like ESSER 1, has a list of very specific things that you can use these funds for. That next one there, if there is one key takeaway that I would hope that all of you would take away from today's webinar, it would be this next bullet item. This is probably one of the biggest changes. And that is, there is a very, very strong focus on learning loss. Everyone from educators to parents to legislators is worried about what this pandemic is doing regarding student achievement. And so there's a very strong focus to use these, in fact, a requirement to use a portion of these dollars to address learning loss. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Allowable uses of funds. These funds have a very similar list as ESSER 1. And so you can use them for all of the same things that you used ESSER 1 funding for. And then Congress added 3 new activities for ESSER 2 funding. So this list here shows you the allowable uses of ESSER 2 funds. And you will notice that all of the ones in black, those were all allowable activities under ESSER 1. So when you applied for the ESSER 1 funds, you checked the box on how you anticipate using the funds. As you complete the quarterly report, you let us know which of those categories you're using the funds for. So all of the black ones are the exact same as ESSER 1. And then they just added 3 additional activities: addressing learning loss, school facility repair and improvement, and then improving air quality. Now, it's important to note that those 3 that they added, they actually were already allowable under ESSER 1, under the emergency preparedness and things like that, and the learning loss under the supplemental learning. So all of those 3 new activities were already allowed. They are just calling them out as separate uses of funds to kind of highlight how they are encouraging districts to use these dollars. There is a document, if you would like to print an allowable use document and have it for, school board meetings or whatever. As you begin to think about how you're going to spend these dollars, there is an allowable use of funds document that has just been posted on the ESSER II website. Again, it's under the resource tab. As far as ESSER II reporting, we all know that whenever we're dealing with federal dollars, there are going to be significant reporting requirements. That's pretty much a given, and ESSER II is no exception. And so just wanted to go through some of the reporting requirements. LEAs that receive ESSER II funding are going to have to report very specific information on the spending. So for example, some of those are, the method used for distance learning. Are you providing internet services? Are you purchasing technology? Basically the same reporting requirements that you reported on for ESSER I funding, and you're going to do this through that quarterly report. In web grants, the quarterly report is called the status report. So you will again complete that status report every 3 months, and you will indicate how you're using these ESSER II dollars. The one thing that was a little discouraging for us is that the ESSER II funds must be accounted for and tracked separately from ESSER I funding. We were kind of hoping that, since they have such similar uses of funds, that it would kind of all be lumped together. We're still kind of planning on just putting the funds in the web grant system and adding them to your current balance. And then you tell us how you're using them as you request them. But a new project expense code is going to have to be provided so that we can account and track for them separately. So once we get information on rolling this out to you, we will send out communication and we will provide you with this new project expense code so that we can ensure these funds are tracked separately. Continuing on with the reporting requirements, there is going to be a mandatory new report outlining how the funds are being used to address learning loss. So again, as I mentioned, that's probably one of the key takeaways. We have to use a portion of the funds to address learning loss, and we're going to have to complete a specific report on how we are doing so. The public can actually track how the state and how districts are using the funds through this new online portal that has been created by the U.S. Department of Ed. It's actually kind of a nice tool. We live in a world where there's lots of fiscal transparency. And so it's nice for parents and the public to be able to see this. The one negative thing is it's significantly behind. So it's old data. So if you would go to this portal right now, it's only what districts have spent as of September 30th. So I know the U.S. Department of Ed has reached out to North Dakota and many other states and questioned, why is our spending so low? Well, number one, we've spent a significant amount more than what this portal is showing. It's just that is as of September 30th. And so we're in January, so we've spent a lot more funding than that. I also had to explain to them that in North Dakota, unique to North Dakota, our school districts were given core and resiliency funding. So the ESSER I funds were kind of, set aside and paused so that you could spend the core and resiliency funds first, since they expired on December 30th, and then districts will go back to spending their ESSER I funds. As I mentioned, we're again required to complete the quarterly reports. DPI will do a nice little summary report after we have reviewed and approved all those quarterly reports. The second summary report was just recently posted to the website and shared in the blast. The third quarterly reports were just due on January 8th. And so we're waiting for a few more districts to have them submitted. We will review and approve those, and then we will complete that summary report. But we'll have to do that with these ESSER II funds as well. And then just a reminder that ESSER funding must be spent according to federal regulations, and the UGG and the EDGAR requirements do apply. So I know I've received emails from business managers wondering if the time and effort and other UGG requirements are applicable to the ESSER I and II funding. Yes, they are. And so things like internal controls, how we account for the funds, time and effort, all those things under the Uniform Grant Guidance, referred to as UGG, they do apply to ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funding. As far as accountability, there's basically 3 areas of accountability within the ESSER 2 statute. And so number 1, of course, is the fiscal that we've been talking about. So we have to make sure that we have a process in place to ensure that the funds are only spent on allowable activities. In North Dakota, that is done through web grants. And so I know that, you know, it's, and you guys have been great, but I know it's a little bit burdensome at times to have to upload receipts and your ledger and all that stuff. But what's nice is that was what we put in our state plan in lieu of monitoring you. What they wanted us to do and what most other states are doing is they're creating a massive monitoring system similar to how districts are monitored for Title I, Title II, special ed. And we didn't want to have to create this big monitoring system or process. So what we put in our plan is that we are going to monitor little by little as we go. So every time districts request funds, we look at ledgers, we look at your receipts, we ensure they're spent on allowable activities, and then that is in lieu of having to come out and monitor you. So that process will continue. Again, we're going to have to collect the data like we talked about in the quarterly reports. And then again, there's this big report on learning loss. And so what the law says is that 6 months after the department receiving the funds, we will have to complete a standalone report outlining how North Dakota districts are addressing this issue and what has been done. And so that will be the beginning of July. And so hopefully we'll be able to get these ESSER funds, ESSER 2 funds out to you soon so that you can start spending them, start addressing the learning loss with these dollars. Obviously, we know you are already addressing that issue, but using these ESSER 2 funds to assist you because we are going to have to complete our first report sometime in July. So as we talked about, 90% of the ESSER 2 funds will go out to school districts. SEAs may keep 10% of the ESSER 2 funds, just like with ESSER 1, to address statewide activities. And so we've had some very preliminary discussions in the department, and basically we will be using our state set aside to address learning needs statewide, basically using our strategic planning process that culminated in the legislatively approved PK-12 strategic vision framework. So if we go through this was a significant process we went through for 2 years that involved all of our stakeholder group, legislators, NDCEL, CTE, just all of our partners, and we together came up with a statewide vision framework, outlined our key goals, our key things, areas where we want to address. So this is going to drive how we use our state level funding. Don't know if any of you have been, have seen anything in the news just this week, but there is actually a possible 3rd round of stimulus funding that is in the works. On January 14th, President Biden announced his proposal for an additional COVID relief package. His American Rescue Plan would provide an additional $130 billion for K-12 education. So just to put that into perspective, the CARES Act provided $13 billion nationwide for K-12 education. This second one, the CARISA, provided $54 billion for K-12 education. And the starting proposal for Biden's plan is $130 billion for K-12 education. So the potential for significant more funding to be coming. Obviously, that's a starting point. There'll be back and forth between the House and the Senate. And that could significantly go down, but that is the proposal that he released just this week. So what are our next steps? Our next steps here in the department is to run the district Title II ESSER II allocations. Most importantly, wait for authority from the North Dakota State Legislature to disseminate this funding. And then once we have that authority, we will be communicating with school districts to provide guidance and training. So the minute we know, you will know. So watch your email. Superintendent Baszler will be sending out communication. We will be providing guidance documents, Q&As, webinars, all the things that we did with our ESSER I funding. So hopefully that will be soon. But again, we will communicate with you as soon as we have additional information. The last slide there provides my contact information. You can contact me, email, phone at any time if you have any questions regarding the ESSER I, ESSER II funding. So that basically concludes the information that we wanted to share with you today. And so we would be happy to take questions and see if we can address any of those questions at this time.
Lori, there have been multiple. Just a second, I'm getting some feedback here. Okay, so there have been multiple questions. The first one is, when will the schools receive funding? Will it go to web grants?
We are anticipating at this time that the funding will be run through web grants. Pretty much all federal funding sources are on a reimbursement basis. Web grants is our brand new grants management system. If we go through web grants, similar to ESSER I funding, we won't have to create a monitoring system. We will just monitor the expenditures as we go. So our preferred method and what we are anticipating is that it will be on a reimbursement basis through web grants.
Okay, there are other ones, but I'm echoing really bad.
Could
Can you
Lisa
see
try,
some
or
of
would
the-
she run into the same? Lisa, you want to try and see if it echoes really bad?
Can you hear me? Lori?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I can try. Let's see.
So there's some in the Q&A and then there's some in the chat.
Okay, I'll start with the chat. Is that all right? There's one that says we can estimate by 3.5 times our ESSER I, not our CARES or resiliency amounts.
Yeah, don't go by the CARES and resiliency amounts. Yeah, those, no other districts in the nation received CARES and resiliency. Those were funds given to our state legislature. They couldn't spend them. So we, DPI, requested them and gave them out as supplemental grants to school districts. So just take your ESSER I allocation times the 3.5, and that will give you a very good idea of how much your ESSER II allocation will be.
The next question is, if we choose to purchase a new curriculum in math because our math scores have dropped significantly and to have a curriculum with an online presence, would this qualify as an appropriate use for addressing learning loss?
Yes, yes, it would be allowable to purchase additional supplemental curriculum, especially one with an online focus. That would be an allowable use of funds and would count as something towards addressing learning loss.
The next question is, we tried to submit a claim on web grants to draw funds on ESSER I, and the site said it is not available.
That is odd. You know, obviously we run into kinks. Try calling either Lisa Johnson or Rebecca Pollard, and we'll help you individually. But yeah, that I haven't heard that one yet, so it must be an isolated incident. But just give us a call and we'll help you with that claim.
My number, this is Lisa Johnson, is 328-2824. Again, it's 328-2824. So let's see, the next one is What is meant by the legislature weighing in on the funding?
So obviously this is a lot of money. And so, the state getting $135 million for K-12 education is significant. It's coming at the exact time that legislators are approving budgets, what the budget is going to be for K-12 education going forward. So I think it's only natural that they're going to wonder, especially since there's no supplement supplant, how can these funds be used in place of state funds to support or supplement state funds? How are there parameters on what they can be used for? So I think those are very typical questions that any state legislature, would or probably is asking in other states as well. So Superintendent Baesler, has been explaining that these funds go out on a reimbursement basis. They have to go to school districts. There is an allowable use of funds list. So yes, that's true. There's no supplement supplant. So they could supplement and use it for, like I said, food service, transportation, things like that, that normally state funds would pay for. But, we have to make sure it's being used on one of the activities in the allowable use list. So those are the types of questions that legislators are asking that Superintendent Baesler has been providing a significant amount of information to them.
The next question is, will CTE Center be getting any funding with the ESSER II or the Biden education?
So similarly with ESSER 1 funding, there are many groups of educators that are left out. And so these funds go to school districts. It's a lot of money. Again, there's a potential for a third round. So school districts are strongly encouraged to reach out to your education partners and share the wealth. That includes, special education, CTE, after school programming, REAs. There's lots of educational partners that are also being negatively impacted with this pandemic that have a need for additional funding. There's plenty of funds to go around. So school districts are encouraged to share their funding as much as possible because, these funds, just like with ESSER 1, only go to school districts.
The next question is our state legislature going to be able to access these funds, or do these have to come to these schools?
The state legislators may have the ability potentially to influence how the funds are spent. They could potentially put limitations or encourage, that the funds be spent on certain things. So, I think they do have some authority to weigh in on how these funds are spent, but ultimately, they can't take the funds and use them themselves. The funds, according to the law, have to flow to school districts.
The next question is, do building improvements have to be tied directly to COVID?
So the language in the law is pretty specific. It's very similar to the language we gave you regarding the core and the resiliency as far as air purification, ventilation. So yes, they are improvements to school facilities that are COVID related, cleaning, things like that. Yes, they are COVID related expenses.
Could some of these funds be used for an extended school year or summer school?
Absolutely. An appropriate and encouraged use of these funds would be for, extending the school year, after school programs, tutoring, summer school, anything that is going to address that issue of the learning loss that so many of our students have encountered because of the pandemic. So that is how, we understand that you have many needs. And so, hopefully you'll be able to address your needs as far as if you have cleaning supplies or facility issues, and you'll be able to use them hopefully in many areas. But like I said, a requirement is that you spend at least a portion of these funds addressing learning loss. And so anything like summer school, extended programs, anything like that is not only allowable, but strongly encouraged.
Would additional personnel to help with learning loss be an allowable expense?
Yes, you just have to be careful about the funding cliff. You know, we have to be careful that we don't add significant staff that we can't maintain long term. But yes, definitely, if you're adding, you know, additional Title I teachers, additional special ed teachers, additional summer school, after school, additional staff to address that issue of learning loss, additional janitors, additional cooks, any additional staff that you need to deal with COVID, to deal with this pandemic, to deal with learning loss, yes, those are allowable uses of these funds. Again, just keep in mind that, you know, we'll have that funding cliff and you won't be able to maintain that long term.
Will the slides be available to share with the school leadership team and parents?
Yes, the School Boards Association is recording the training. They're going to post the link on their website. We can also post it on our DPI ESSER 2 website, and we will provide these PowerPoint slides in this week's weekly blast, and we'll also post it on our ESSER 2 website.
I'm going to move over to the question and answer now. The first question is, when will the schools begin to see this funding? Will it go through web grants?
Again, we are anticipating at this time that it will be through a reimbursement process through web grants. As far as the timeline, we just don't know. Again, many times a day, Superintendent Basler is meeting with legislators, presenting, providing information. She's trying to make them knowledgeable about all of these additional funds and what the regulations say. And so as soon as they're satisfied with you know, the information she shared, and as soon as they give us the authority to proceed, then we will be sending out communication to all school districts.
The next question was similar, so I'll go on to the next one. Is there a timeline for non-public schools to know their allocation?
Right now, the governor needs to apply for the funds. That's step number one. And again, there's a timeline in which they are able to do that. Anne is working very closely with Maria Nesset. And then once we know if we are able to access the funds, then Anne will be reaching out and determining the method that we're going to use in North Dakota to determine those non-public allocations and what each allocation chart will be. So as soon as Anne knows more information, she'll be reaching out to non-public schools.
Is there any word if the State Department will continue to fund ExactPath? We will need to know this so we can set funds aside if the Department of Public Instruction will not cover the expense.
Yes, we have received, even before we knew about this second round of funding, we've received questions about whether ExactPath will continue to be funded. It has been shared with Superintendent Basler that districts need to know this information sooner than later so that you can plan. So we are currently having those discussions right now, looking at the number of students that are using that program, weighing options as far as, you know, if we're going to continue to fund that. So information should be shared very soon so that you can plan accordingly.
We choose to purchase a new curriculum in math. Oh, I believe we already addressed that one. For WPSD number 1 and D8 reorganization to Williston Basic School District, how will the funds be handled?
Why don't you reach out to us individually and we'll talk about how that will be handled. We're basically using old data. You know, we're using our same Title I information that we used for ESSER 1 funding. So I don't think that'll be an issue, but if you want to give me a call, we can talk about your unique situation because of the reorg.
The next question is, I believe this was already answered, but I'll read it again. So could they take the money away and the districts won't get it? I'm assuming they use the legislature.
Yeah, again, the statute requires the funding to go to school districts.
Also, if there's a note, North Dakota School Boards Association would like to answer this. So I don't know if does she want a moment to talk? No.
I'm good. You can keep talking.
Okay. Do I understand it correct that legislature could use the money to fund schools instead of an addition of funds?
No, the legislators have the authority to weigh in as far as you know how these funds are going to be used. They are looking at ways that it could possibly supplement or take the place of state funds. I mean, there is no supplant provision, so some of the allowable uses are things that state dollars are paid for, but again, not all of them. So again, these discussions are all happening right now. They are just wanting to know what our options are as a state. And as soon as information is final, then we will share with you information.
I believe that's all of the questions that I can see.
Okay, and like I said,
there's one more here. No, someone just, if the state legislature doesn't address transportation funds lost due to reduced miles in the spring of 2020, can ESSER be used for that?
Yeah, if you look at the allowable use of funds, transportation is on that list. So I will say potentially, I know we've had some issues with other districts recently about shortages, and there are some regulations that we have to be careful that we can't just pay for shortages in food service or shortages. So potentially we'll get you more information on that in the near future, but it is allowable. It is food service and transportation are on the allowable use list. We just have to make sure we're paying for actual expenditures for food and transportation, and we have to be careful that we're not filling in gaps for shortages.
There's another question. Can we plan on disbursement this fiscal year?
We hope so. Again, we're waiting for authority, and once we get the green light, we're ready to move. We certainly hope that it's soon. As I mentioned, we have to complete a report on what our state has done to address learning loss using these ESSER II funds. So we are hopeful that we will be able to disseminate the funds soon.
That's all I have for now.
And again, if you have other questions, you can contact us at any time. Plus, as soon as we have more information, we'll do another webinar, we'll do Q&As, we'll provide additional guidance. So please know that lots of additional information is going to be forthcoming in the coming weeks. Right now, we're just kind of on a pause until we get the green light to proceed.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lori, for your very informative presentation on ESSER II. Remember that this webinar recording, slides, and any associated resources will be available on our NDSBA website at www.ndsba.org under resources. Our next Lunch and Learn is set for February at noon. We will be discussing superintendent evaluation tips and best practices. If you would like to take part in this session, remember to register if you have not already. Registration information for upcoming NDSBA Lunch and Learns can be found on the NDSBA website under the Resources tab. If you have found this information useful, please let your fellow education leaders know so that they can watch and possibly join next time. Thank you again for joining us today. We truly appreciate your participation. Contact our office at 1-800-932-8791 if you have questions on any of the information you heard today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all the best. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.